On the 22nd of August in 1961, 6 individuals made a critical error on Lenox Avenue in Harlem. They crossed Bumpy Johnson by taking $250,000 that belonged to him. Before the following day ended, the entire city of New York came to understand the cost of such a transgression. This wasn't about anger, and it certainly wasn't about ego. It was calculated strategy, timed precisely to the hour. A single individual chose not to pursue common thieves. Instead, he completely rewrote the rules of engagement. So what exactly transpired during those 48 hours that made everyone freeze in their tracks? To grasp the final outcome, we need to go back to the initial phone call. The afternoon clock showed 4:30 when Detective Raymond Kowalski pushed his way through the chain-link barrier at the construction location in Queens, with his partner Frank Torres following just 3 steps behind. The anonymous caller had phoned in 20 minutes earlier, their voice controlled and exact, providing only the address before the connection went silent. Kowalski now comprehended why the person on the line had sounded like they were reporting a traffic collision rather than a murder scene. The odor struck first. Damp concrete mingled with the metallic scent of bodily fluids that had seeped from injuries and oxidized under the August heat. Cement particles floated thick enough to coat the throat's interior, making breathing difficult without triggering coughs. The location should have been vacant. Laborers had departed at 3. Equipment sat silent. Nothing stirred except the dust, gradually settling in atmosphere that seemed to possess physical weight. 6 individuals stood planted in a foundation excavation, entombed from their midsection downward in concrete that had solidified around them like granite. Each person displayed a bullet wound precisely centered on their forehead. The entry mark was clean and surgical, the type of shot that demanded placing the gun barrel directly against flesh and squeezing the trigger while the victim remained immobile and waiting. Not one of them had collapsed. The concrete maintained them upright, arms secured behind their backs with wire that had bitten deep enough to leave visible marks from 20 feet away. Their eyes stayed open, gazing at emptiness. Jaws hung loose. One individual had bitten completely through his bottom lip before the projectile came. Teeth impressions were distinct, tissue ripped where he had clamped down hard enough to taste his own blood. Another showed dark trails running down both legs, where his bladder had emptied sometime during the 12 hours he had stood buried, waiting for the conclusion that everyone assured him was approaching, but which refused to manifest until whoever orchestrated this decided the psychological element had been adequately satisfied. The police photographer lifted his camera, hands trembling severely enough that the initial photograph emerged unfocused. He dropped the camera, turned his back, and expelled the contents of his stomach onto the ground. Torres, 19 years working homicide, made the sign of the cross even though he hadn't stepped inside a church since his mother's passing. "Jesus Christ," Torres murmured, the words emerging like a prayer despite his abandoned faith. "This isn't murder. This is a goddamn ritual. Somebody wanted these individuals to stand here for hours knowing precisely when their deaths would occur. Wanted them to feel every single minute elapse. Wanted them to comprehend that compassion wasn't arriving and that nobody would rescue them." Kowalski descended into the excavation, boots grinding on gravel, needing to examine the bodies from a nearer distance. The concrete had been poured with exactness, halting precisely at waist level. Why not simply execute them in an alley and dispose of them in the river? Why invest the effort in burying them vertically and forcing them to wait? "Because whoever orchestrated this wanted to transmit a message," Torres responded, igniting a cigarette with hands that continued trembling slightly. "Not merely to these 6, but to everyone who learns about this. You cross the wrong individual. You don't receive a quick bullet to the skull. You get 12 hours entombed in concrete, standing in your own waste, watching the sun traverse the sky, and knowing that when it reaches a particular angle, someone will approach and drive a bullet through your head while you stand there powerless to move or flee or resist." Comprehension demanded knowing the participants. Bumpy Johnson controlled Harlem with intelligence that rendered violence unnecessary 90% of the time. But when violence became essential, it was measured to generate maximum impact with minimal need for repetition. He was 56 that August of 1961, hair graying at the temples, suits custom-tailored to conceal physical strength that hadn't diminished with age. Those who knew him grasped that his reputation derived not from being New York's most vicious operator, but from being the most exact. Genovese commanded the family bearing his name, functioning under the conviction that Italian heritage granted privileges that included testing whether colored operators in Harlem genuinely possessed power or merely occupied positions through fortune and temporary forbearance. He had been pushing limits for months, dispatching collectors into territories that arrangement and mutual comprehension had designated as restricted, waiting to observe whether Bumpy would answer with force or with negotiation that would expose weakness. Illinois Gordon functioned as Bumpy's second-in-command, the individual who monitored schedules and responsibilities and obligations, who understood which threats demanded immediate action and which could be documented for future settlement. He possessed memory that retained everything and patience that permitted him to wait years for the proper moment to remind someone that accounts always balanced in the end. The 6 individuals standing deceased in Queens had been professional enforcers in Genovese's operation, experienced in crushing fingers with pliers when business proprietors fell short on protection payments, skilled at igniting fires that appeared accidental enough to evade arson scrutiny, comfortable with the variety of violence that maintained neighborhoods compliant, and tribute flowing upward to individuals who never soiled their own hands. Kowalski circled the excavation, studying each body from various perspectives, attempting to comprehend the sequence of circumstances that had produced this tableau. The concrete is fully set. That requires hours, minimum 8, likely 12 depending on the mixture and the temperature, which means these individuals stood here all night and half the day entombed up to their waists waiting. Why not execute them immediately? Torres questioned, crushing out his cigarette beneath his boot heel. Why force them to stand here for 12 hours before placing bullets in their heads? Because someone wanted them to contemplate what they had done, Kowalski stated, voice emotionless. Wanted them to experience every minute of waiting. Wanted them to attempt bargaining and pleading and threatening and finally accepting that none of it would alter the outcome. This wasn't about killing 6 individuals. This was about making their final hours contain such fear that when word circulates, everyone who hears the account will comprehend that swift execution is mercy. And mercy is something you earn through conduct, not something you receive automatically. One of the forensics personnel arrived, a woman named Sarah Chen, who had processed 300 homicide locations and prided herself on sustaining professional detachment regardless of circumstances. She looked into the excavation and her jaw tightened, the sole visible reaction before she began photographing from multiple perspectives and announcing observations that would later be typed into reports that would circulate through NYPD and FBI and eventually land on desks of prosecutors, who would read them and determine that pursuing this case would demand resources and witnesses that didn't exist and probably never would, execution style, all 6, Chen stated, her voice steady despite the scene. Single shots, no exit wounds, small caliber, probably 22 or 25. Professional work, no shell casings visible, which means the shooters policed their brass or used revolvers. Concrete is a standard construction mixture, nothing distinctive that would trace to a specific supplier. Wire restraints are industrial grade, the variety you can purchase at any hardware store in the city. Whoever planned this knew precisely what they were doing and took steps to ensure we would discover bodies, but no evidence linking them to any particular person or organization. Torres ignited another cigarette, his third in 15 minutes. This didn't start here. This started somewhere else, probably 48 hours ago, based on rigor and decomposition. These individuals did something that someone determined required this specific form of response. The question is what they did and who they did it to. The narrative wouldn't make sense until they traced it backward, following the thread from this excavation in Queens to whatever incident had triggered a response calibrated to produce maximum psychological impact. Someone had invested considerable time and resources into making 6 individuals stand buried in concrete for 12 hours before executing them. And that investment suggested the crime they had committed was serious enough to warrant not just elimination, but demonstration. Not just punishment, but education delivered in a format that would be remembered and discussed and used as reference point whenever someone contemplated similar actions. There are endings that serve only to terminate life, quick and efficient, and forgotten within weeks, as the next crisis demands attention. Then there are endings designed to initiate fear that spreads like contagion through networks of people who hear the account and recalibrate their understanding of what consequences look like when delivered by someone who views violence not as emotional release but as strategic communication, requiring careful planning and flawless execution. The telephone shattered the silence like a gunshot in a cathedral. Bumpy Johnson answered on the second ring, already knowing that calls at this hour meant someone had crossed a boundary that would require correction, measured in broken bones or worse. Illinois. Gordon's voice came through the line, stripped of everything except facts. The counting house on Lenox got hit. Gord found unconscious, skull cracked. Probably a pipe or a sap to the base of the neck. Safe is open. Combination used cleanly. 250,000 in cash gone. They knew precisely what they were doing and precisely when to do it. Bumpy's hand tightened on the receiver hard enough that the plastic groaned. How many people knew that combination? 5. You, me, Marcus, Samuel, and Jimmy. One of them talked, or someone put a blowtorch to their testicles until they surrendered it. The counting house held a week's accumulation of collections from every numbers operation in Harlem. Cash that belonged to people who had placed wagers believing the system was honest, that winners genuinely got paid, that the operation had rules even if those rules existed outside the law. Someone entering and taking that money wasn't just theft. It was a blade in the throat of everything Bumpy had constructed over 30 years. Bumpy walked to his study, bare feet silent on hardwood that was cold enough to make him conscious of every step. The lamp cast shadows that made the room resemble something from a crime scene photograph. Duke Ellington still played on the turntable, needles stuck in the final groove, repeating the same scratching sound every 2 seconds like a heartbeat that refused to stop. Illinois arrived 20 minutes later through the back entrance, moving with the careful silence of an individual who understood that loud footsteps at 4:30 in the morning attracted attention from neighbors who might remember faces. When police came asking questions that nobody wanted to answer, "Tell me what doesn't add up," Bumpy said, pouring 2 glasses of whiskey because this conversation required something stronger than coffee. Illinois pulled out a notebook, flipping to observations written in code that would resemble grocery lists to anyone who intercepted it. Safe opened with a combination, not blown or drilled. Inside job, no question. Guard neutralized without gunfire, which means professionals who comprehend that gunshots bring cops and cops bring problems. Timing was surgical, hitting the window between midnight collection and 6 a.m., counting when the safe holds maximum cash and minimum personnel watching it. This was military precision, not street thugs getting lucky. Bumpy drained his whiskey in one swallow, the burn traveling down his throat and settling in his chest, where it mixed with the cold understanding that someone had just declared war using his money as the opening shot. They aren't testing our security. They're testing whether I've gone soft, whether Harlem can be robbed without consequences, whether a colored man's operation is fair game for anyone with enough audacity to kick in the door and take what they want. We take the money back. We look weak, Illinois said, stating what both individuals already understood. We negotiate. We look weaker. We go crying to the commission, asking for arbitration. We might as well hang a sign on Lenox Avenue that says, "Rob us, we won't fight back." The only response that works is a response that makes everyone understand that stealing from us is a death sentence with no appeal and no pardon. Illinois leaned against the wall, arms crossed. "What are we going to do?" "We're going to find the 6 individuals who did this," Bumpy said, his voice carrying the flat certainty of someone who had already mapped out every step and was now simply describing conclusions that calculation had produced. "We're going to make them understand that they made an error that cannot be corrected through returning the money or apologizing or begging. We're going to do something that people will discuss for the next 20 years whenever someone suggests that maybe Harlem looks like an easy target." By 10 that morning, 3 separate sources had delivered the same information. 6 soldiers from Vito Genovese's Brooklyn crew had executed the raid. Professionals who specialized in high-value extractions where planning mattered more than firepower. Names came with the information, faces that had been photographed by police at previous crime scenes. Individuals who had broken legs with baseball bats to collect debts, and who had set fires that burned buildings down to their foundations when business owners refused to pay protection money. Bumpy studied the list of names written on paper that would be burned before sunset, memorizing each one as if committing them to the same mental ledger, where he kept track of debts owed and debts collected, and people who had tested him, and discovered that testing carried prices measured in years of pain rather than dollars of profit. "Genovese sent them," Illinois said, lighting a cigarette and blowing smoke toward the ceiling. "This wasn't freelance work. This was Vero testing whether you still have teeth or whether you've become an old dog who barks but doesn't bite anymore. Vito thinks that because I'm 56, and because my hair is grey, and because I haven't personally broken someone's ribs with a tire iron in 5 years, that means I've lost the capacity for violence, Bumpy said, his jaw tightening in the only visible sign that rage was building beneath the surface, like pressure in a boiler that had been sealed too tight. He thinks that colored operators in Harlem exist on his sufferance, that we pay tribute because we lack the strength to refuse, that our territory is his territory, and he simply allows us to manage it as long as we remember our place. So what do we do? Illinois asked, though he already knew the answer because he had seen this particular expression on Bumpy's face 3 times before. And all 3 times it had ended with people disappearing and rumors spreading and everyone recalibrating their understanding of what consequences looked like when delivered by someone who viewed violence not as loss of control, but as precisely calibrated instrument for teaching lessons that could not be taught through words. We take those 6 individuals, Bumpy said, his voice dropping to the register he used when explaining things that could not be repeated outside this room. We don't kill them quickly. We don't dump them in the river where they disappear and become statistics. We do something that makes every soldier in every family across 5 boroughs understand that Bumpy Johnson is not an individual you rob. We create a monument that lasts. Something visible and permanent and terrifying enough that 20 years from now, people will still be telling the story to new recruits as a warning about what happens when you mistake patience for weakness. Money could be recovered. Operations could absorb losses and continue functioning. But reputation, once damaged, took decades to rebuild. And during those decades of perceived weakness, other predators would circle and test, and gradually consume everything until nothing remained except memory of what had once existed before someone decided that mercy was the same as vulnerability, and that vulnerability invited exploitation that would continue until violently corrected. 6 individuals scattered across Brooklyn, each one following routines that had kept them alive through years of work that most people didn't survive. They lived in different neighborhoods, drank at different bars, kept different hours, and trusted different women who might or might not report their movements to people willing to pay for information. Catching them individually would be simple. Catching all 6 simultaneously before any of them could warn the others required precision that most operations couldn't achieve. If we grab one, the other 5 disappear into the city within an hour, Illinois said, spreading photographs across Bumpy's desk, each image showing a different face, different body type, different patterns of movement that would need to be mapped and predicted. These are professionals. They have escape routes planned. They have safe houses stocked. They have cash buried in locations that only they know about. The moment one of them fails to check in, the others will assume compromise and activate protocols that make them impossible to find. Bumpy studied the photographs with the attention that surgeons gave to X-rays before cutting into bodies, understanding that success required knowing not just where these individuals were, but where they would be at specific moments, how long they would remain in those locations, and what methods of extraction would work without creating noise that would alert targets at other locations. The problem isn't finding them. The problem is taking all 6 in the same 60 seconds before any of them can reach for a phone or trigger an alarm that cascades through their network. Bumpy divided the operation into 5 phases, each one dependent on the previous phase being executed with precision that left no margin for improvisation or adjustment. Illinois took notes in the shorthand they had developed over 15 years of working together, symbols that look like accounting records, but actually described movements and timing and contingencies that would activate if primary plans failed. Phase 1, identification, Bumpy said, tapping the first photograph with his index finger hard enough to leave a mark on the glossy surface. We need complete schedules, where they sleep, where they eat, where they drink, where they engage in intimate activities, where they collect money, where they meet with their handlers. We need to know their routines down to the minute, what time they leave their apartments, what route they take to their first stop, who they talk to, who they trust. We have 48 hours to build profiles that are accurate enough to predict their locations within a 5-minute window. Illinois nodded, already mentally compiling the list of informants who would need to be activated, the watchers who would need to be positioned, the bribes that would need to be paid to bartenders and building superintendents and prostitutes who serviced individuals who talked too much after they finished and before they paid. Phase 2, isolation, Bumpy continued, moving to the second photograph. We cut their communications. No phone calls warning each other. No runners carrying messages between locations. We position people at key intersections who can intercept anyone trying to move information from one target to another. We create an information blackout that prevents them from coordinating response or activating their escape protocols. Phase 3, synchronization. All 6 extractions happen within the same 60-second window, not 1 minute apart, not 5 minutes apart, but simultaneous strikes that prevent any of them from receiving warning that would allow them to run or fight back. We need 12 individuals, 2 per target, working off the same clock, executing on the same signal. Illinois pulled out a list of names, individuals who had worked for Bumpy for years and who understood that discipline mattered more than aggression. That following orders exactly as given was more valuable than improvising solutions that might work or might create complications that cascaded into failures. I can assemble 12 who will do exactly what they're told without asking questions or making noise. Phase 4. Neutralization without gunfire. Bumpy continued, his voice dropping to the register he used when explaining details that could not be repeated outside this room. Chloroform or ether applied from behind. Chemical restraint that puts them down fast, without giving them time to scream or struggle or alert anyone nearby. Guns make noise. Noise attracts attention. Attention brings police and witnesses and complications that turn clean operations into investigations that don't close. Phase 5. Disappearance. We move them to vehicles that aren't registered to anyone connected to us. Drive routes that avoid traffic cameras and toll booths. Transport them to the location where the next phase begins. No witnesses see the extractions. No cameras record the vehicles. No evidence connects the disappearances to any specific person or organization. Illinois finished writing and looked up from his notebook. This requires perfect execution at every stage. One mistake, one target who doesn't follow his routine, one watcher who falls asleep, or one driver who takes a wrong turn, and the entire operation collapses. Then we don't make mistakes, Bumpy said. His jaw set in the expression that Illinois had learned meant the decision was final, and arguing would accomplish nothing except wasting time that needed to be spent on execution rather than debate. We've been doing this for 30 years. We've taken people off the street 100 times. This isn't different, except in scale and consequences of failure. 46 hours of surveillance produce schedules accurate to within 5-minute windows. By 11:30 on the evening of August 22nd, 12 individuals were positioned at 6 locations across Brooklyn, each pair watching a target who had no idea that tonight was different from any other night, that the routines they had followed for years had been mapped and predicted and would now be used against them with the efficiency of machines designed for single purpose. 23:47. The signal went out on synchronized watches that had been set to the same second that afternoon. 6 pairs of individuals moved simultaneously, approaching from angles that had been calculated to minimize visibility and maximize speed of engagement. Chloroform-soaked rags came out of pockets, applied to faces from behind, with pressure that cut off airways and forced victims to inhale fumes that shut down consciousness within 15 seconds. At a bar on Atlantic Avenue, Vincent Moretti was lifting a glass of whiskey when 2 individuals grabbed him from behind, one hand clamping over his mouth while the other pressed chemically soaked fabric against his nose. His glass fell, shattering on the floor, but the noise was lost in the general din of conversations and jukebox music. By the time anyone noticed he was gone, he was already in the trunk of a Chevrolet heading toward Queens. At a diner on Flatbush, Tony Scalise was paying his check when the attack came, quick and efficient, his body going limp before he could reach for the revolver in his waistband. The waitress who saw him being helped out by 2 individuals assumed he had gotten drunk, which wasn't unusual for Tony, and went back to refilling coffee cups without giving the incident another thought. 4 more extractions played out with identical precision at 4 more locations, each one executed within the same 60-second window. Each target neutralized and removed before anyone nearby understood that what they were witnessing was abduction rather than friend helping friend get home after too much drinking. By midnight, all 6 individuals were unconscious in vehicles heading to the construction site in Queens, where concrete had already been mixed and forms had already been prepared, and an excavation had been dug to specifications that would become clear when the sun rose and revealed what had been created during the night. Real power wasn't making people disappear through violence that left bodies in alleys and investigations that sometimes produced arrests. Real power was making people disappear so cleanly that witnesses saw nothing worth reporting, and victims understood nothing until they woke up, already buried, and realized that escape was no longer possible, and that the only remaining question was how long they would stand waiting before the final bullet arrived to end the waiting. 1:30 in the morning, and 6 individuals woke up buried to their waists in concrete that had already begun to harden around their legs like stone, the chemical reaction generating heat that they could feel through their pants and skin. The construction site in Queens sat empty, except for these 6, and the 4 individuals standing guard with shotguns, watching in silence as the captives tested their restraints and discovered that wire had been wrapped around their wrists tight enough to cut circulation. Vincent Moretti tried to pull his legs free, straining against concrete that might as well have been steel. Tony Scalise twisted his body, attempting to work his hands loose, succeeding only in driving the wire deeper into his wrists until blood began seeping down his forearms. "Where the hell are we?" Moretti shouted, his voice echoing off the concrete walls. "Who did this? You know who we work for. You know what Vito is going to do when he finds out you grabbed his people." One of the guards chambered a round in his shotgun, the mechanical sound carrying more threat than words. The message was clear. Talking was permitted. Screaming would be answered with buckshot. 2:10 in the morning, and headlights cut through the darkness as a black Lincoln pulled up. Bumpy Johnson stepped out, dressed in a suit despite the hour, moving with measured pace. Illinois Gordon followed, carrying a folding chair that he set up 10 feet from the edge of the excavation. Bumpy settled into the chair, pulling a cigar from his jacket and lighting it with a match that he let burn down to his fingers before shaking it out. He smoked in silence for 2 full minutes while 6 individuals stood buried in concrete, watching, waiting. "You took $250,000 from my counting house on Lenox Avenue," Bumpy said, his voice carrying across the excavation without shouting. "You opened my safe with the combination that one of my people gave you, probably after you broke his fingers with pliers or held a blowtorch to his feet. You walked out with my money, thinking Vito Genovese's protection would keep you safe." He paused, smoke drifting up into the night. "You were wrong." Tony Scalise's voice came out shaky. "We'll give the money back. All of it plus interest. Just let us out of this hole and we'll make it right." Bumpy shook his head. "The money isn't the problem. The problem is that you thought you could take from me without consequences. The problem is reputation." He stood, walking to the edge of the excavation. "It's now 2:15 in the morning. At exactly 2 this afternoon, 12 hours from now, 6 individuals are going to walk up to this excavation and put 1 bullet each into your heads. You have 12 hours to think about what you did." "You can't do this," Vincent Moretti said, voice cracking. "Vito will come after you. The commission will come after you. You'll start a war." "Vito will do nothing," Bumpy replied, tone flat as steel. "Vito will accept that his people violated agreements and paid the price. The commission will review what happened and conclude that I responded proportionally, and everyone will understand that this is what happens when you steal from Bumpy Johnson." "Please," Tony whispered. "We have families. We have kids. So do the people whose money you stole," Bumpy said. "So do the runners who collect that money every day in neighborhoods where getting robbed means your children don't eat. You thought about your families when you were spending my money. You can think about them now while you wait." He turned and walked back to the Lincoln. 12 hours, gentlemen. Use them wisely." The sun rose at 6:17. Light crept across the site, illuminating 6 individuals who had been standing for 5 hours. Their legs had gone numb, circulation cut off by concrete. Thirst dominated everything now. Mouths dry, throats raw, tongues swollen. "Water." One of them croaked around 7. "Please, just water." The guard said nothing. Vincent Moretti began praying. "Hail Mary, full of grace. The Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women." "Shut up with that," Tony Scalise snarled. "Your prayers aren't going to save us. Nothing is going to save us." "Maybe someone will come," another voice said, desperate and hollow. "Maybe Vito sends people to find us." "Vito doesn't even know we're missing yet," Tony replied. "And when he finds out, you think he's coming here to rescue us? He's going to let this happen and then tell everyone we deserved it for being stupid enough to rob Bumpy Johnson." By 9, the sun had turned the excavation into an oven. Sweat soaked through their shirts. Skin blistered where the sun hit exposed flesh. One individual's head lolled forward, unconscious from heat and dehydration. But the concrete held him upright, transforming his body into a monument, whether he was awake to experience it or not. "How much longer?" someone asked. 5 hours, another voice answered. 5 more hours. Around noon, the guards ate lunch within sight of the excavation, drinking from canteens, biting into sandwiches. Vincent Moretti watched them eat, his throat working convulsively, trying to produce saliva that no longer existed. "You're eating in front of us," he shouted. "You animals. When this is over, when Veto hears about this, he's gonna do worse to you. He's gonna make you beg for bullets." One of the guards looked up, chewing slowly, then swallowed before speaking. "Vito already knows. He got a call at 8 this morning," he said, and I quote, "Let Bumpy do what he needs to do. Those 6 idiots earned whatever they get." The words landed like physical blows. Vincent's head dropped forward. Tony started laughing, a sound with no humor in it, just the broken noise of an individual whose last hope had just been executed more thoroughly than his body would be in 2 hours. "We're already dead," Tony said. "We've been dead since we walked into that counting house. We just didn't know it yet." 1:30, 90 minutes remaining. The sun had passed its peak, beginning the slow descent toward evening that they would not live to see. 2 of them had stopped responding to anything, eyes open, but seeing nothing. Minds retreating to places where concrete and heat and waiting didn't exist. "I want to tell my wife something," Vincent said suddenly. "I want someone to tell her that I'm sorry, that I should have been better, that she deserved better than what I gave her." "No one's going to tell her anything," one of the guards replied. "Your body is going to stay right there in that concrete until the cops find you. Your wife is going to hear about it on the news, just like everyone else. That's part of the message." This historical reconstruction examines power dynamics for educational purposes, not as endorsement of violence. The strongest fear doesn't come from not knowing when you'll die. The strongest fear comes from knowing exactly when death arrives. From watching the clock count down your remaining minutes while you stand unable to run or fight or do anything except wait for the bullet that has been scheduled, like any other appointment that cannot be cancelled. 2 o'clock arrived, with the precision of a clock striking the hour in a courtroom where the verdict had already been decided and the sentence was about to be carried out. 6 individuals stepped out of a black panel truck that had been parked 50 yards from the excavation since 1:30, giving the condemned time to see them coming. Time to understand that the waiting was over and that whatever had sustained them through 12 hours of standing in concrete was about to be tested in the final seconds of their lives. The executioners wore no masks. They walked with the measured pace of professionals executing a job that required precision rather than speed, each individual carrying a revolver that had been cleaned and loaded that morning. Chambers checked twice to ensure no mechanical failure would interrupt the work or force repetition that would diminish the impact of what was about to happen. Vincent Moretti started screaming when he saw them approach, voice raw from dehydration but still carrying enough volume to echo off the construction equipment. "Please, please, we're sorry. We'll do anything. Please just let us go. We'll never come back to Harlem. We'll leave New York. Please." The words cut off when the first executioner raised his weapon and placed the barrel against Vincent's forehead, the cold metal pressing into skin that was hot from 12 hours in the August sun. "Close your eyes or keep them open. That choice is yours. Everything else has already been decided." 6 revolvers rose in unison, each barrel finding the center of a forehead. Each executioner standing close enough that missing would require active effort rather than simple failure of aim. The condemned individuals reacted differently in their final seconds. Vincent squeezed his eyes shut, lips moving in prayer that had no time to complete. Tony Scalise kept his eyes open, staring at the individual who was about to kill him with an expression that contained no fear, only the exhausted acceptance of someone who had run out of the capacity to feel anything except the desire for the waiting to end. "On 3, the lead executioner said, his voice carrying across the excavation to where the other 5 stood with weapons pressed against flesh and bone and the thin barrier between consciousness and oblivion. 1. 2 of the condemned individuals began crying, tears running down faces that had been burned by sun and crusted with salt from sweat that had dried and reformed dozens of times throughout the day. Another started hyperventilating, breath coming in, rapid gasps that suggested his heart might give out before the bullet arrived. 2. Tony Scalise spoke his final words in a voice that came out surprisingly steady despite the circumstances. Tell Bumpy he made his point. Tell him we understand. 3. 6 shots fired simultaneously, the reports echoing across the construction site and bouncing off surrounding buildings, creating sound that would be heard by workers in nearby warehouses and residents in apartments 3 blocks away, all of whom would later tell police they heard something, but couldn't identify the source or direction, couldn't say with certainty whether the noise had been gunfire or construction equipment or trucks backfiring on the street. 6 bullets entered 6 skulls and destroyed the brain tissue that separated life from whatever came after. The mechanical process of lead penetrating bone and soft matter, occurring faster than nerves could transmit pain signals, or consciousness could register that injury had occurred. 6 bodies jerked from impact, heads snapping back before settling forward. But none of them fell. The concrete held them vertical, arms still bound behind their backs, legs still buried to the waist, transforming corpses into monuments that would remain standing until someone decided to break them free, or until weather and time eroded the concrete and allowed them to collapse into the excavation that had become their grave. The executioners lowered their weapons, each individual checking his target to confirm that the job had been completed successfully, that no follow-up shot would be required, that the work they had been paid to perform had been executed with the professionalism that Bumpy Johnson's operations demanded. They walked back to the panel truck without speaking, engines starting, vehicles pulling away from the site and disappearing into afternoon traffic that absorbed them like water absorbing drops of rain. 4:30 in the afternoon, and Detective Raymond Kowalski's phone rang, with a call from dispatch, reporting an anonymous tip about bodies at a construction site in Queens. The voice on the tape had been male, calm, giving the address with precision that suggested familiarity with the location, then disconnecting before the operator could ask follow-up questions or attempt to trace the call through methods that sometimes worked and sometimes produced nothing except wasted time. Kowalski and Torres arrived at 4:32, stepping through the chain-link fence, and immediately understanding why the caller had sounded calm rather than panicked. This wasn't a crime scene where victims had been discovered by accident. This was a display that had been constructed deliberately, designed to be found and photographed and discussed, created specifically to send a message that would ripple outward through networks of people who needed to understand what consequences looked like when delivered by someone who viewed violence not as loss of control, but as carefully calibrated communication. By 5, 3 more detectives had arrived, along with a forensics team and medical examiner and photographer who would document the scene from every angle before anyone attempted to remove the bodies or disturb evidence that probably didn't exist beyond what was visible to anyone standing at the edge of the excavation. By 6, word had spread through NYPD that something unusual had been discovered in Queens, and by 7, every organized crime detective in the city knew the basic details, even if official reports had not yet been filed or distributed. By 8 that evening, the account had reached Brooklyn and the Bronx and Manhattan, carried by cops who talked to informants, who talked to criminals, who talked to bosses. The information moving through channels faster than official investigation could track or interrupt. By 9, Vito Genovese had received phone calls from 3 different sources, all describing the same scene, all asking the same question about whether he knew who the 6 individuals were and whether he planned to respond to what had been done to soldiers who worked under his protection. Genovese's response was brief and carefully calibrated to prevent escalation that would benefit no one. They violated agreements that have kept peace in this city for 20 years. They paid the price that violations require. Anyone who thinks differently can end up standing next to them. The message had been delivered and received and understood. A message only carried value when it didn't require repetition. When the first demonstration was sufficiently clear and sufficiently brutal that everyone who heard about it adjusted their behavior accordingly without needing to experience the consequences personally. Bumpy Johnson had just taught a lesson that would be remembered for decades, not because of the 6 individuals who died, but because of the method used to kill them. The 12 hours of waiting that converted execution into psychological torture, the concrete that held them standing as permanent reminder that some boundaries, when crossed, produced responses that far exceeded the original violation. The FBI opened a case file on August 24th, assigned agents who interviewed witnesses who had seen nothing and heard nothing. Forensics found no fingerprints on the wire restraints, no shell casings, no tire tracks, nothing except 6 bodies standing in concrete and bullet wounds. that provided no evidence connecting the killings to any person or organization that could be prosecuted. The commission convened on August 27th in a private room above a restaurant in Little Italy. Genovese sat at that table, explaining that his soldiers had violated agreements by raiding Harlem without authorization, that Bumpy Johnson had responded proportionally to an attack on his operations. He buried 6 of my people standing up and made them wait 12 hours before killing them, Genovese said, voice tight with anger he couldn't fully suppress. He turned them into monuments. He made them an example, Frank Costello replied, lighting a cigar. He demonstrated that stealing from him carries costs that exceed the value of what was stolen. If we punish him for this, we're telling every crew in the city that they can raid independent operations without consequences. The vote was 4-1 in favor of no action against Bumpy Johnson. Genovese was reprimanded and ordered to return the $250,000. Payment delivered 3 days later by a courier who handed Illinois Gordon a briefcase and left without speaking. For the next 7 years, until Bumpy Johnson died of heart failure at Wells Restaurant on July 7, 1968, no one attempted to rob his operations. The counting house on Lenox Avenue continued functioning without additional security because everyone understood that taking money from Bumpy Johnson wasn't theft, but suicide with extra steps. Other families revised their assumptions about Harlem. Territory that had been viewed as potentially vulnerable was now understood as defended by someone whose response to violation exceeded normal boundaries of proportional retaliation. Bumpy Johnson had demonstrated that he valued reputation more than efficiency, and that crossing him meant experiencing consequences designed not just to punish, but to educate every criminal in the city. The account spread beyond New York, carried by criminals who moved between cities, and told the tale in bars and prison yards. Bumpy Johnson buried 6 guys standing up became shorthand for extreme response, a reference point that needed no elaboration because everyone understood exactly what kind of individual would conceive such punishment. Bumpy Johnson died in 1968, collapsing at a restaurant table while eating breakfast, heart giving out after 62 years of stress and violence, and the constant pressure of maintaining control in an environment where weakness invited predation. The standing burial became legend, an account that was told and retold, details embellished but core truth remaining intact. 6 individuals had stolen money and had been made to stand buried in concrete for 12 hours before being executed, their bodies left upright as monuments. The power came not from the fact that 6 individuals had died, because people died every day in New York's underworld. The power came from the method, from the 12 hours of waiting that converted execution into psychological torture, from the concrete that held bodies standing after life had departed, from the care that had gone into creating spectacle that would be remembered decades later. Young criminals entering the life in the 1970s and 1980s heard the account as cautionary tale from older individuals, warnings delivered in the same tone that fathers used when teaching sons about dangers that could be minimized through proper behavior. You don't steal from people like Bumpy Johnson became a principle that governed conduct even after Bumpy himself was gone, his reputation surviving his physical existence and continuing to influence decisions made by people who had never met him. In a Brooklyn social club in 1975, a young soldier asked his captain whether the account about the standing burial was real or just a myth designed to scare new recruits into obedience. The captain, who had been active during Bumpy's era, put down his drink and looked at the kid with an expression that contained no humor. "It was real," the captain said. "I know because I was one of the guards who stood watch while those 6 individuals waited to die. I watched them go from angry to bargaining to praying to brokenness, watched the sun cook them for 12 hours, watched them urinate themselves and cry, and beg for mercy that wasn't coming. And I'll tell you something else. Every time I thought about doing something stupid after that, every time I thought about crossing a line or taking something that didn't belong to me, I remembered those 6 individuals standing in concrete, and I decided that whatever I wanted wasn't worth ending up like them." Real power didn't come from killing large numbers of people. Real power came from making people understand that testing your boundaries was an error they would regret during whatever time remained between the testing and the consequence. Bumpy Johnson had achieved that through 6 individuals standing in concrete, and that achievement outlasted his life and became part of how criminals operated in territories where formal law existed, primarily as obstacles to be avoided rather than authority to be respected. This account is shared for historical insight and personal reflection, not to promote violence or illegal behavior. Thank you for watching until the end. These accounts take weeks of research and writing to create. If this resonated with you, if you see the lesson Bumpy Johnson was teaching about accountability and education over violence, hit that subscribe button. Help us reach 1 million subscribers so we can keep telling accounts that matter. Accounts about power used wisely. Accounts about consequences faced honestly. Accounts about individuals who chose to change systems instead of just destroying enemies. The next video drops soon. Until then, remember, real power isn't what you can destroy.